morning or afternoon to those who are joining us today. Happy FSMA Fridays, or I will be tempted to call it FSMA Tuesdays, but again, thank you for everyone's joining us. So we had to switch over just for this format for this month to Tuesday, and looks like that did not dissuade the crowd in our final wrap-up of the season of FSMA Fridays. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jill Bender with Safety Chain, and when we begin, just want to wish everyone a happy and healthy holiday season and new year, and we're excited to dig in today. So with me today, I am delighted, of course, to have Dr. Acheson on the phone, as well as Melanie Neumann. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just before we get started, just a reminder, we always send the recording out. A few days later, we'll have lots of questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible, and we'll look forward to just getting started here. So, David, let's just dive in. FSMA updates. What do we got this December?
Well, Jill, always a good question, and I think the good news is nothing new. It's like as if we haven't had enough to digest over the last couple of months from the FDA. No, they've been pretty quiet. At least on the FSMA front, I think there's lots and lots of action going on other fronts, which isn't really the topic of what we're going to talk about. But from a FSMA perspective, quiet. I suspect that they are still on track for the 2 rules that we're waiting for in next year, in March and May, for sanitary transport and food defense. I know they're working busily on guidance documents, and they too are promised in early 2016. So I think we're in those phases. But on the pure FSMA front, Jill, I think it's very quiet, and we'll keep it that way, hopefully.
Right. Well, a little bit of noise too on the funding, right? As far as trying to get more funding for this program.
Yeah, right. Always the funding push, indeed. Absolutely. Yep. And the FDA actually, to that point, did end up getting most of what they asked for at the end of the day with the budget. So we'll see if that actually makes a fundamental difference, but hopefully it will. Okay,
great. Well, for today, we are going to focus on the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule as well as the third-party rules. So we'll just go ahead and get started with some of the questions that came in initially, and we'll go ahead and start with you, Melanie. How is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program different from supply chain controls in the Preventive Controls Rule?
Well, good morning, Jill, and that's a really great question, and happy holidays to everybody who joined us. I can't believe it's the end of the year, and we've gotten through 12 FSMA Fridays, or in this case, Tuesday. So always great to be back. And really good question with respect to the differences, because these 2 rules do kind of jive and interrelate together. So here's where the rubber hits the road. In short, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule nets out, it applies to importers, and the supply chain controls requirements, if they apply at all to you under the Preventive Controls Rule, will apply to manufacturers under that Preventive Controls Rule. So really one of the initial pivotal questions is going to be, are you an importer or not? I'm not going to tackle that question. David gets the privilege of tackling that question, so I'm not going to dive into that one. But where this nets out is that if you are a manufacturer and you're relying on your supplier to manage a hazard that requires a preventive control, which is language straight out of that final Preventive Controls Rule, versus you're managing that hazard yourself through, for example, cooking, then you need to implement a supply chain control program under that Preventive Controls Rule. If you're an importer, then you fall under that FSVP rule, and you need a Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which pretty much walks and talks just like that supply chain control program under the Preventive Controls Rule. So much so that FDA said that in the final rule that if you meet the requirements in the final Preventive Controls Rule for that supply chain control program, you've met the requirements in the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule. So you don't need to double up or double down and have a duplicate system. So I know that's a mouthful, but what really is going to be dependent and kind of an initial phase to ask yourself is, if you are a manufacturer, the next question is, are you also an importer? or not. And then also the next question would be, do you need to rely on your supplier to manage the hazard that requires a preventive control for you or not? So maybe we look to David as far as asking and answering the question of how is an importer defined?
Okay, great, and that is absolutely our next question. Sounds like it's not straightforward, or perhaps it is. David, your thoughts? How is FDA defining an importer?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jill, and thanks, Melanie, for that answer. I think what FDA has done in the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, in my view, has simplified the definitions, and I'll get to it in just a second. But I think just to sort of build off what Melanie said, a lot of people are scratching their head and saying, well, I know I have to be compliant with the preventive control rule because I manufacture or process food. I'm starting to get my head around the supply chain risk control piece of that, but I'm also an importer because I'm importing my ingredients. So I'm very definitely an importer, and I'm having to comply with Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Question, do I have to do that? I know I have to comply with the preventive control rule. So I think just to build off what Melanie said is that if you're a company and you know you have to be compliant with the preventive control rule, and yet you are an importer, the FDA has made it pretty clear that you're off the hook with regard to Foreign Supplier Verification Program. You may be importing 90% of what you use for ingredients. It doesn't matter. If you've got your supply chain control part buttoned up as part of preventive controls, as Melanie said, they're very much aligned, then you're good. You don't have to worry about Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So it really, this is sort of the build-up. So then what's the definition of an importer? And these are companies, individuals, groups who are importing food into the U.S., but would not need to be compliant with the preventive control rule because they're not a manufacturer, processor, packer, or holder of food. They're an importer. That's what they do. So what the FDA has said in terms of the definition of an importer is basically it's someone who's got a financial interest in the imported food. And they also have to be knowledgeable over the control of the food supply chain. And that person who's got the financial interest and essentially is the consignee or the U.S. owner of the food at the point at which it arrives in the United States would be the entity that needs to be compliant with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And that would be designated as an importer, as I've said, who is not in need of being compliant with the preventive control rule because they don't have to register with FDA as a manufacturer, processor, packer, or holder of food. So the nuance here is that not all importers have to comply with FSVP. And if I've just confused everybody, it's because if you are compliant with the preventive control rule and you are an importer, then you're good. If you don't have to be compliant with the preventive control rule and you're an importer, then Foreign Supplier Verification Program applies to you. And what you have to do under that is very similar to what happens under the preventive control rule. So, okay, scenario one is it's a U.S. owner, consignee, I'm importing the food, I'm an importer. But what if there's no U.S. owner or consignee of the food at the time it comes into the U.S.? Then the foreign entity, the foreign owner or whoever is shipping the food, has got to designate a U.S. agent or a representative to serve basically as that importer. And the foreign entity has got to identify a U.S.-based entity that will take on that responsibility to be the person who will have the responsibility for compliance with Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And that's not quite the same as the importer of record. The importer of record is a different animal under the Bioterrorism Act. It absolutely could be the same entity, no question about that. But the rule, I think, has been pretty clear that it's got to be somebody based in the U.S., and that if there isn't somebody who's obviously the consignee or the receiver of that food and will take responsibility, then the exporter has to find somebody to do that. And those are kind of the two nuances. In the earlier versions of the rule, there was some suggestion that it actually could be the exporter who takes on that role, but the agencies made it pretty clear in the final reg to my read that it cannot be the exporter to the U.S. It has to be somebody based in the U.S. So think of the importer as the entity who's taking financial responsibility of the food. They've got the responsibility of checking that the supply chain is good, and if they are not compliant or having to be compliant with the preventive control rule, then they will have to be compliant with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So hopefully that hasn't confused the heck out of everybody. It is actually relatively simple to split this up, and with a bit of luck, people have tracked with at least half of what I've said, Jill.
Well, I think I've tracked to maybe about 90%. I think, but yes, well, it's, as far as like the definitions of you fit in this box or this box, but still all under FSMA, right? I mean, it's
right.
One way
Yeah,
or another.
yeah. It's exactly. It's all under FSMA. I mean, I think where the FDA is going with this is they want to make sure that all food coming into the United States and sourced from a supply chain is controlled under some set of regs or other. So they've really said you're in one or the other. You're either in foreign supplier verification or you're under preventive control. And the nuance is, well, where do I fit as an entity? But, you know, it's like no one gets off the hook
Right.
unless there's a designated exemption.
Okay, and I think that leads really nicely into our next question, which I'm going to go ahead and pass that over to you, Melanie. Let's go a little bit further then as far as the, let's see if I get, there it goes. What is the responsibility of the importer then to comply with FSVP?
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And, you know, David did a great job of explaining the differences and the definition of that importer and touched on a bit of what the importer's responsibilities are, but I'll try to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what those responsibilities are. Really on a high level, that importer needs to verify that their foreign suppliers are achieving that same level of public health and safety as U.S. food safety laws are meant to achieve and are there to set forth and achieve. So really what that means is that those importers are verifying that the foreign suppliers are meeting the preventive controls rules or the produce safety rules right now. And they're making sure that those suppliers are not importing food that's frankly either adulterated or misbranded, that they're attesting to the fact that they're meeting, again, those U.S. food safety laws. But ultimately, above and beyond that, importers have other heavy lifts and responsibilities that they need to achieve under this rule as well. They need to be performing hazard analysis, almost just like if they were a manufacturer, to determine if there are known or reasonably foreseeable hazards, and they need to evaluate the risks based on that hazard analysis, based on suppliers' performances. So they need to start to get to know these suppliers and their behaviors. They need to approve the suppliers. They need to determine appropriate verification activities, again, based upon the supplier's behaviors and performance, and conduct those verification activities, which could include on-site audits for risks that rise to the level of serious adverse health consequence or death. They need to perform corrective actions and when things go off the rails. So, you know, this litany of responsibilities really shows, Jill, that importers are in the big leagues now. They're required to create a foreign supplier verification program for each food brought into the U.S. This is work now, not just paperwork, Jill.
Right, so not just record keeping, but actual work around that paperwork, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, let's go into one of the components you talked about just from a audit standpoint. And David, I'll go back to you. Let's talk about a little bit about the purpose of the third-party audit rule.
Yeah. The third-party audit rule, I think, has got, on the face of it, Jill, has got a lot of people confused. And I think the fundamental answer to this question is what's the purpose of it, is it's focused on two very, very specific areas. And I think one of the questions that a lot of people have had is, does this rule mean that every third-party auditor has got to go through some process here that this rule is dictating, and we've all got to do it, and everybody's got to get certified and accredited and da-da-da-da. And the answer to that is no. That is not what this rule is about at all. There's obviously lots of auditors out there right now doing audits for GFSI and for other schemes, and this rule has absolutely nothing to do with any of that. It doesn't impact any of that one scrap. And as Melanie said, part of the supply chain control is you may have to have a third-party audit that goes out and assesses the risks on site if the risks are deemed high enough. Those auditors are not part of this rule. That's a completely different can of worms. So what is the purpose of this rule? And it's really focused on just two key areas. And those are, at a high level, situations where FDA requires certificates for certain types of food before it can be imported into the U.S. That's scenario one. And scenario two is the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. So it's just those two scenarios. And we touched briefly in FSMA Fridays on the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program and on the certification of high-risk foods. So let me just take a second and explain at high level what those are about, just to remind everybody. Turn the clock back to January 2011, when FSMA was signed into law by the President. One of the immediate authorities that FDA were given was the authority to require a certificate for what they deemed, FDA deemed, to be a high-risk food. And the FDA could say, this food will not be allowed into the U.S. unless it is accompanied by some certificate to authenticate that the production of this food or the growing of this food has met all U.S. FDA regulatory standards. They had the authority to require that, and they could do it for any food commodity. They could do it for countrywide. They could do it for a region. They could do it for manufacturer. There was a lot of scope that they could do this for, require this certificate. To my knowledge, FDA has yet to implement that authority that they have to say, all right, that product coming into the U.S. has got to have a certificate on it. They will do that. I have no doubt that they will do that at some point for high-risk foods. A whole different set of questions, which we won't get into on this one, is how are we going to define the high-risk foods? But leave that on the side. FDA defines a high-risk food. They say this cannot come in, these shipments from this country, this manufacturer needs a certificate. This third-party audit rule is all about who are the auditors that are going to be able to apply that certificate. Who can go out to that foreign facility and deem that this food is being produced to the correct standards, issue the appropriate certificate that will accompany that shipment or that batch of food into the U.S. and meet those requirements. The rule, this third-party audit rule, is all about the accreditation and oversight of auditors that are going to fulfill that function, and that function alone with regard to certification of high-risk foods. Scenario two, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. This is a program that's definitely worthy of a lot more discussion and comment down the road in FSMA Fridays. It's not live yet. It's kicking in, I think, 2017, if I remember rightly, is when it potentially starts. And you know, the euphemistic way of describing what this is all about is ensuring that foreign suppliers, foreign manufacturers have reached a top standard and that their food coming in is safe. It's a heavy audit process. There's a lot of things that have to be put in place to meet the VQIP requirements based on the guidance document FDA put out earlier this year. And again, it requires an accredited auditor to go into that plant and assess, do they meet VQIP, Voluntary Qualified Importer Program requirements? And if they do, then the auditor checks the box, then this particular foreign manufacturer gets designated VQIP, and they get the fast lane into the U.S. And this whole rule is focused on making sure that auditors who are fulfilling those two functions, VQIP certifications and high-risk food certifications, are following what's in this rule, which is pretty stringent in terms of what they've got to do and what they have to report to FDA. And I know we're going to get into that in just a second. But hopefully that clarifies it. It does not apply to your regular GFSI auditor, it's a different animal.
Okay, great. And I know there's always been quite a bit of talk around this component. One, and we think about demystifying a little bit. And Melanie, I'll throw this over to you. The next question, in regards to third-party auditors, and people have talked about are they going to need to report findings to the FDA? Is this true?
Yes, they are. We don't have time to get into all the details on this one, but if you're going in to do an audit, a regulatory audit for the purposes of issuing these certificates, then you have to provide a pretty comprehensive report to FDA of what you found, where you've been and what you did within 45 days of having gone in there. There is also a requirement if you are in that facility to do one of these audits for a VQIP or for this high-risk food, and you see something which might constitute a public health risk in the food in that facility.
Oh, interesting. Are you still there, Dave? Oh, I think we might have lost him. David, are you still there? Melanie?
Yeah, I'm here, Jill. Yeah, and David's exactly right. If you see something, I think to David's point, what he was saying is if you see something that constitutes a serious health risk, that whether you're there for a regulatory audit or a consultative audit, those auditors do have a duty to report that finding to FDA first, prior to letting that facility know.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, that is a very interesting finding, and that's kind of a word to the wise and a little bit of a heads up to you all that that is a reporting obligation that is found right within the wording of the rule.
Of that specific component. Now, was that part of the original, or did that make it to the final?
That was a part of the proposed rule, and it stuck with respect to the final draft. Or the final rule, yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. Well, let's see if David's made it back online with us. David, are you there? Oh, I think he might have dropped off. Hopefully we can try to get him back onto the call. We do have a couple more questions. Melanie, let's see what we have here, and we'll keep going. And David, if you can hear us, do try to call back in. Now, Melanie, I know that we had spoken a bit about the third-party auditors with David, and this was really his area that he was going to dive into. But I don't know if there's anything here that you want to lend to as far as do all third-party auditors have to be accredited?
Sure, and I think David did touch on that with respect to this rule, it does not apply to your standard GFSI audit. Not all auditors need to be accredited under this rule. Was very specific to the VQIP program and the certification for high-risk foods. So it's only in those two specific instances where the accreditation needs to be provided. And other than that, this rule does not, require that certification going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we'll keep humming along until David comes back. Melanie, I'm glad you're still with us. Thank you. David, pipe in when you are able to get back in. This in just regards to who does the accreditation. And I know there's certainly been a lot of talks, and there's been topic of many different sessions at the various conferences this last few months that I've seen. Something you could share further on this, Melanie?
Sure. It's very specific, and typically it is either FDA itself and or a foreign government that can do the accreditation. So, that's kind of a very specific, not anybody can do the accreditation. It is, again, very specific. And typically it is FDA who is doing the accreditation of a certifying body, and then that certifying body will then basically accredit the auditor who then is certified to then go conduct those audits. Foreign governments can also accredit and then certify auditors to then conduct these types of audits as well. And then, you know, third parties, once they've achieved that, can go and perform those audits as well.
Okay, great. And I believe I've seen quite a few links that really kind of digs into this one. And if we have a few questions, perhaps we could send those out individually. And then let's see, I believe we have just one more question in regards to this components. And let's see, I'm not sure if David's back on with us, but we'll keep going here. He must have gotten caught up in the snow somewhere. Well, actually, it's just really talking about, you know, what's on the horizon. That's our crystal ball. Obviously, going into 2016, we know we have 2 more rules that will be finalized and coming out. David mentioned March and May. I'm assuming that we'll see more usage as far as now that the FDA has the ability to really move on some of these things with FSMA. What are you looking at, Melanie, going into next year?
Absolutely. Well, we certainly do still have the intentional adulteration rule to finalize, as well as the sanitary transportation rule. So those are definitely on the horizon, Jill. So definitely keep your eyes open for that, folks. Also, I think what's on the horizon as far as my crystal ball is concerned is implementation of your food safety plan. That should be on your horizon in 2016 to be ready for the preventive controls rule for humans, for example. So for those of you who are large firms where you've got the September 2016 effective date for that particular rule, start now. 2016 and January of 2016 is a great time to have your New Year's resolutions and create your FSMA implementation team. And take a look at your HACCP plan, take a look at your prerequisite programs, see how you can repackage and rebuild those to create your food safety plan. Do your hazard analysis, do that refreshed assessment to see how you can leverage and repackage those to start working on that food safety plan. Because FDA has said that's where they're going to look first. That's where they're going to start first to see how ready are you? How prepared are you for these rules and the implementation and the compliance of the preventive controls rule and the rest of these rules? Because if they find your food safety plan strong, robust, and sufficient, they're probably going to pat you on the back and be on their merry way. If they don't find it very robust and strong and sufficient, they're going to start to pick at it. They're going to start to peel back the onion. They're going to start to ask questions about training, for example. They're going to ask questions about your documentation and your record keeping. And that's where they're going to start to poke holes at it. It's going to rise and fall on the strength of that food safety plan. And so I would encourage you all to really focus on that food safety plan and the strength and the robustness of that. I think we're just going to really see the FDA inspectors being prepared as well. FDA has created a very strong training program internally as well as externally through the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance. They're conducting a great program on lead instructors to be able to do an externally facing training program to get preventive controls qualified individuals trained up. So the external training program is rolled out now and is going strong. But also FDA's internal inspector training program is very strong, and they're going to be coming into your facilities with a newfound strength by way of knowing what they're looking for. And I think we're going to see a new era of inspectors who are going to be very educated on these rules, and a little less of a time where I've heard clients say, you know what, I was just inspected by a medical device expert. You know, what the heck? and we're not going to see as much of that anymore. FDA has got a very strong internal training program as well as an external training program. So as far as my message to industry would be in 2016, take a look at your training program. How strong is your training program, and is it specific? Because your training program should not be one size fits all. Your forklift driver and your staff that actually handles and touches food should not be the same. It should be specific to the roles and responsibilities that your team members have. So Jill, those would be my crystal ball predictions for 2016. And I certainly thank everybody for joining us on this FSMA Tuesday, and really thank everybody for joining us for the course of 2015. Really, you know, Safety Chain and the Acheson Group can't thank you enough for your continued tuning in through the course of 2015. And we really hope that you join us in 2016, where we continue to give you news on the latest FSMA findings and developments, and hopefully in a new and fun format as well. So I'm not going to tell you what that is. I'm going to entice you to stay tuned in 2016. Back to you, Jill.
Okay, great. Thank you. And it looks like David might have found himself back in here. Fane, if you could just unmute him. There we are. And David, I'm not sure how much you heard, but Melanie pulled out her crystal ball, and it was glowing quite a bit with good information.
Yeah, I just picked up the very end of that. Sorry about that. We have about a foot of snow on the ground here, and unfortunately, I guess the power line went down and cut all my power out, but I'm back.
Well, you're back, and we do have a few questions, but just sort of following up on what Melanie has said. You know, we've this FSMA Fridays, we've been sort of overwhelmed by the participation and the number of participants, and that continues to grow. So, you know, we'll look to continue to provide the value, and also rolling out a few new formats for next year so that we can keep this momentum going, but certainly keep it a very informative, valuable time for everyone involved. With that, we do have a few questions. I want to get to those, and of course, I'm going to always mention that, you know, a lot of information is always out here. There's always going to be definitive questions that you have for your organization in defining the gaps of your current plans or programs and what needs to be satisfied. So TAG is absolutely a good resource for that, and I'll always say Safety Chain will be the one to help you make, from a program compliance automation standpoint, we're there for you. But I do want to get into some of the questions we have here to kind of wrap up our end-of-year FSMA Fridays. So let me get right to those. Couple questions here. Here's one from Margaret. Is U.S. agent for FSVP same as the food facility registration, or can it be someone else? And I don't know, Melanie, do you want to take that?
This is David. Let me try and jump into that.
Please. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, my belief is it can be somebody else. It does not have to be the same person. This is the registration requirement in terms of the Bioterrorism Act that we're talking about versus the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. There's nothing I've read in the rule to say it has to be the same person. I may have missed a nuance, and if somebody out there knows that, yes, it does, then please, you know, jump in and educate us all. But my belief is it could be somebody different.
Okay, great. Moving on to a couple other questions here we'll get to. Will FDA issue a logo with a regulatory audit under the third-party accreditation rule? And how long are these audits? Are they valid? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years?
I have no idea about a logo. That's an interesting question.
Right.
If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say no. You know, the FDA is not very sort of logo-oriented particularly, and just imagine the paperwork and red tape that they'd have to go through to even agree on a logo. Anyway, so no, I don't think that'll happen, but currently these are looking like they'd have to be annual. Most of this is around annual checkups, annual renewals, particularly for under the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. That's going to be annual. I think the certification for high-risk foods, I haven't seen a lot of, because they haven't used it yet, but what will cause them to put a food on that list and then, if ever, take it off, I don't know. But I think that's going to be at least annual. It may even be more frequent than that, depending on the risk. For the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, non-third-party audits, so you know the standard audit to make sure that a food company is meeting those requirements for your preventive control rule. If it's the requirement for a third-party audit, because there's a high level of risk, those two are annual based on the rule.
Okay, great. Have a couple other questions here, and again, sort of the value of FSMA Fridays is the general questions, but also specific ones to specific people online with us. So this one might not be straightforward, but let's go ahead and throw it out there. I am a shipper. I import produce and ship it to others for processing. At present, I have limited controls. Will this change with FSVP?
Melanie, do you want to take that? I've got some thoughts on that, but why don't you give that one a shot?
Why don't you go for it, David? You've got some thoughts on it. Since I punted while you dropped.
the shipper in this context is a question to ask is, are you, per my earlier answer to the question, are you the importer? And if the answer to that is yes, because you are the consignee, the receiver of the food in the United States, then, and you are, per the definition in the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, you are the importer, then you will need to be compliant with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, absolutely. If you are the shipper and you are designated as an exporter, so in other words, you're shipping from outside of the U.S., then you're going to have to find an agent in the U.S. who will take on that responsibility for compliance with FSVP. Either way, the expectation from FDA is that that food will be compliant with all aspects of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And you are going to need the paperwork to prove that through, depending on the level of risk, through some testing, certificates of analysis, etc., or third-party audits or something else of a review of the system that is deemed by the agency to be equally robust. So if you are the shipper and you don't have good controls, or you don't know whether you have good controls, then you're going to have to get them. But ask yourself first and foremost, am I the importer? And if you are, then FSVP would apply to you.
That would apply, correct? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just pick up one more, if we don't mind hanging on. And this is, one specific scenario, but I think it could be on folks' minds, certainly, in their course of doing business. Scenario here is we need an ingredient from a supplier in an emergency, that's in quotes, basis, because our current supplier cannot meet our needs. Can we receive ingredients with identified hazard from a supplier without an audit or on a provisional basis? Interesting.
Great question. Yeah. There are provisions for temporary approvals. Absolutely. I'm more familiar with the ones actually in the preventive control rule, and they are definitely there for temporary approvals in situations like this where you have to temporarily approve a supplier and just make sure that you're controlling the risks. I think the FDA is going to say, figure out who's controlling those risks. Don't be doing it too much either. And I want to say that there's the same provision for Foreign Supplier Verification Program, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. I think there is for temporary approvals, but the FDA recognizes that they're not. They need to be flexible in terms of business and how suppliers suddenly they go out of business or they have a problem or they can't ship and you've got to move to somebody else. And they have built-in provisions for temporary situations. I think the key point here is don't abuse it and don't be having everybody as temporary, and make sure that your fundamental programs are robust. And I'm trying to think, Jill, I think they did put a timeline on how long they can be temporary, but I don't want to give wrong information out as to how that is. Need to check back on the rule on that. But, yeah, there are provisions for bringing people on temporarily.
Yeah, and this is, you also need a written procedure as far as what your process is for approving on a temporary basis from unapproved suppliers. So as long as you have a process and you contemplate from time to time that you're going to need to approve on an emergency basis, you just need to have a written procedure, follow those written procedures, don't deviate from those written procedures, and don't leave them on your temporary list forever, to David's point, because you do need to have them as temporary on only a very finite basis and still have a certain amount of verification activities that you can do, you know, in a pretty immediate fashion conducted. So anything you can do in a very, very short order, do it. And then what you can't do to get them all the way vetted and approved through your normal course of your supplier verification program, then that's recognized. You put them on your temporary list, but you're following your written procedures for your temporary / unapproved suppliers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely, have a protocol procedure in place to do this. And maybe from a practical perspective, Jill, I'm thinking that if you run your analysis, and to Melanie's point, you're not just going to accept a supplier. You do need to run your hazard analysis on the supplier and say this supplier needs a third-party audit, but I need their ingredients like yesterday. I think there are ways that the FDA would find acceptable to say, well, we're going to rely on testing, certificate of analysis, as long as it's robust, or some testing on receipt by the recipient that serves in lieu of the third-party audit, but we're going to get that done, to Melanie's point. We're going to get that done quickly and don't leave them on the temporary list too long. So I think there's workarounds, and the agency recognizes there has to be in order to allow business continuity. But as with all these things, it's not completely prescriptive, and I think you've just got to be very judicious as to how you execute on temporary ones, and have the FDA when they look at your programs, they say, well, yeah, that stuff happens, but we're okay because it's under control.
And I do think that's, you know, the general theme, right, with FSMA in general, and that's the perfect question to end our session today. And, you know, thank you for everyone for staying on extra long here. There are some questions we didn't get to, unfortunately, and as Melanie alluded to, we're absolutely looking forward to continuously improving our program format here with FSMA Fridays going into next year, and a part of that is getting to more questions in some manner and fashion. But with that, I do need to wrap up, and I do thank everyone for being involved with us this past year or so with FSMA Fridays. Dave and Melanie, to your team as well for your continued validation and explanation of FSMA and demystifying it and really giving credible information on how to be compliant. It's just been fabulous, and we've always got great input on that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's session and wish everyone a happy and healthy new year. We look forward to another fun year next year going to 2016. Do encourage always to look at tags and Safety Chain's site and reach out to us if you need help in any fashion of gap analysis, compliance management, and so forth. But just in general, again, thank you for continuing with this forum. It's been invaluable, and we look forward to continuing in the new year. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.